There's a particular kind of fear that comes not from what you know, but from what you don't. Layla had lived with that fear her entire life, sheltered behind palace walls, educated by tutors, protected from everything except her own imagination. She wasn't afraid of the world outside. She was afraid she'd never be allowed to see it. Until the day her father announced her marriage to a man she'd never met, a sheikh from the northern territories, whose reputation preceded him like a sandstorm, fierce, untamed, impossible to escape. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from, and if you feel it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. Your support makes all the difference. The palace of Al-Qamar sat at the edge of the desert like a jewel carved from amber stone, its towers reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Inside, the air smelled of jasmine and cardamom, scents that had marked every moment of Layla's 22 years. She knew every corridor, every garden, every hidden alcove, where sunlight fell in golden squares through the carved wooden screens. This place was her entire universe, beautiful and suffocating in equal measure. She stood now in her chambers, surrounded by handmaidens who fluttered around her like nervous birds, adjusting the heavy wedding gown, pinning the delicate veil, painting her hands with intricate henna patterns that would take hours to dry. The designs were traditional, symbols of fertility and protection, blessings for a union that felt more like a transaction than a blessing. Layla watched in the mirror as they transformed her into someone she didn't recognize, a bride, an offering, a political solution to tensions she barely understood. Her reflection stared back with dark eyes too wide, too frightened. She had her mother's face, oval and delicate, with high cheekbones and lips that seemed designed for smiling, though she rarely did. Her hair fell in thick black waves past her waist, currently being twisted and braided with gold thread and tiny pearls. She was beautiful. Everyone said so, as if beauty were some consolation prize for a life she hadn't chosen. The door opened, and her Aunt Miriam entered, dismissing the handmaidens with a wave of her jeweled hand. The older woman's face was kind, but weary, marked by years of navigating palace politics and family obligations. She sat beside Layla on the cushioned bench, taking her niece's trembling hands in her own. "You're shaking, child," Miriam said softly. "It's natural to be nervous." "Nervous doesn't begin to cover it," Layla whispered, her voice barely audible. "Aunt Miriam, I don't know him. I've never even seen his face." "I know," Miriam acknowledged, and her honesty was somehow more comforting than false reassurances would have been. "But I've made inquiries. Sheikh Khalid is known as a hard man, but a fair one. He's built schools in his territory, brought water to drought-stricken villages, settled tribal disputes that had lasted generations." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" Layla asked, pulling her hands away. "That he's good at governing? What about being a husband? What about—" She faltered, her cheeks flushing. "What about tonight?" Miriam's expression softened with understanding. She reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind Layla's ear. "Listen to me carefully. Men like Sheikh Khalid, men who carry power and responsibility, they understand control. They understand patience. You're not being sent to a monster. But you are being sent to a stranger," Layla said, and her voice cracked. "I don't know what he'll expect. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to be someone's wife when I barely know how to be myself." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Layla had been taught languages, history, poetry, music. She could recite verses from ancient texts and play the oud with grace that brought tears to listeners' eyes. but no one had taught her about this. About the intimate reality of marriage, about what happened when the doors closed and the veil came off, and she was alone with a man who now owned the rights to her body, her future, her entire existence. "You'll learn," Miriam said gently. "And if he's half the man his reputation suggests, he'll teach you with kindness." Layla wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe that somewhere in this arrangement, built on politics and territorial alliances, there might be room for gentleness, maybe even eventually for something that resembled affection. But belief required hope, and hope felt dangerous when you'd spent your whole life learning that your desires mattered less than your duty. The sun was setting when they came for her, turning the sky into layers of orange and purple and deep rose. Layla walked through the palace corridors on trembling legs, her gown so heavy she felt like she was carrying the weight of every expectation placed upon her. The wedding ceremony would be brief, a formality really, since the contracts had been signed weeks ago by men in rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. This was just the public acknowledgement, the religious blessing, the moment when she stopped being her father's daughter and became Sheikh Khalid's wife. The ceremonial hall was filled with people, faces she recognized, and dozens she didn't. Tribal leaders and diplomats, and relatives from branches of the family tree she'd never bothered to memorize. They all turned to watch her enter, and she kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the intricate tile patterns beneath her feet, geometric designs that had taken craftsmen years to create. One foot in front of the other, she told herself. Just breathe. Just survive this. At the front of the hall, near the fountain that sparkled in the lamplight, stood a figure in traditional ceremonial robes. Sheikh Khalid. Even from a distance, even with her eyes lowered, Layla could sense his presence like a physical force. He was tall, broad-shouldered, radiating an authority that made the space around him feel charged. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. When she finally reached his side, when she finally had no choice but to look up, her breath caught. She'd expected someone older, hardened by desert life and political warfare. Instead, she found a man perhaps in his early 30s, with features that were startling in their intensity. Sharp jawline darkened by carefully trimmed beard, straight nose, lips pressed into a serious line. But it was his eyes that held her frozen, deep brown, almost black, intelligent and assessing. He looked at her not with hunger or possession, but with something more unsettling. Curiosity, as if she were a puzzle he intended to solve. The imam began the ceremony, his voice sonorous and formal, reciting prayers and blessings in classical Arabic that flowed like music. Layla responded when prompted, her voice barely above a whisper, agreeing to vows she'd had no part in writing. Khalid's responses were steady, measured, each word pronounced with deliberate care. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a rough quality that suggested he was more accustomed to giving orders than making promises. Then came the moment when the imam pronounced them married. When Khalid reached for her hand and slid a ring onto her finger, heavy gold inscribed with verses about love and devotion. His fingers were warm, calloused, surprisingly gentle as they touched hers. She dared to glance at his face again and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not quite a smile, but not the stern mask she'd expected either. Something in between. Something that made her pulse quicken for reasons she didn't entirely understand. The feast that followed was a blur of faces and congratulations, of music played on ouds and drums, of dancers who moved like flames given human form. Layla sat beside her new husband at the head table, acutely aware of the mere inches separating them, of the occasional brush of his robes against hers, of the way people watched them, speculating, judging. wondering what kind of union this would become. She barely touched the food placed before her, elaborate dishes of lamb and saffron rice, honey-soaked pastries, pomegranate seeds that gleamed like rubies in golden bowls. Her stomach was too knotted with anxiety to accept anything more than a few sips of rosewater. Khalid, in contrast, seemed completely at ease. He spoke with tribal leaders who approached their table, discussing water rights and trade routes with the same casual confidence other men might use to discuss the weather. He was clearly a man accustomed to command, to having his words treated as law. Yet when he turned to Layla occasionally, offering her choice pieces of fruit, or asking if she needed anything in a voice low enough that only she could hear, there was a carefulness in his manner that surprised her. He didn't touch her beyond what was necessary for appearance's sake. He didn't press conversation when she responded with nervous monosyllables. He simply existed beside her, solid and steady, like a mountain that had no need to prove its strength. As the evening wore on, as the moon rose high and silver over the palace gardens, Layla felt the weight of what was coming pressing down on her chest. Soon the feast would end. Soon there would be the ceremonial escort to the bridal chambers. Soon she would be alone with this stranger, who was now her husband, expected to fulfill duties she understood only in the vaguest, most frightening terms. Her hands trembled in her lap, twisting the heavy fabric of her gown until her knuckles went white. It was Khalid who noticed. His hand covered hers, large and warm and impossibly gentle, stilling the anxious movement. She jumped at the contact, her eyes flying to his face. He leaned closer, close enough that she could smell the subtle scent of oud wood and something else, something clean and masculine that made her breath catch. "You're afraid," he said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Yes, she admitted, because what was the point of lying? His eyes held hers, searching, assessing. Of me? She swallowed hard. Of everything. Of what's expected. Of what I don't know how to do. For a long moment, Khalid said nothing. Then, so quietly that she almost missed it, he murmured, "Then we'll learn together." Before she could ask what he meant, before she could process the unexpected gentleness in those words, the drums beat a particular rhythm that signaled the end of the feast. The women of her family rose, surrounding her, preparing to escort her to the bridal chamber. Layla's heart kicked into a panicked gallop. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading. The moment everything changed forever. The walk to the chambers felt both endless and far too short. Her Aunt Miriam squeezed her hand once, whispering, "Be brave, child. Trust yourself." Then Layla was alone in a room she'd never seen before, specially prepared for this night. The space was beautiful, almost overwhelmingly so. Silk curtains in deep crimson and gold hung from the ceiling, creating a canopy over a bed scattered with rose petals. Lamps cast soft golden light that danced across walls painted with intricate patterns of vines and birds. Incense burned somewhere out of sight, filling the air with sandalwood and amber. It was designed for seduction, for romance, for the kind of passionate union that poets wrote verses about. But Layla felt none of that romance. She felt only a terror so profound it made her dizzy. She stood in the center of the room, still in her heavy wedding gown, unsure whether to sit, to stand, to remove the veil, to wait. Every scenario she'd imagined felt wrong. Every possible action seemed like it might be a mistake. So she simply stood there, frozen, listening to her own rapid breathing and the distant sounds of celebration still echoing through the palace. When the door opened, she spun around so quickly she nearly lost her balance. Khalid entered alone, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the sudden silence. He'd removed the formal outer robes he'd worn during the ceremony, now dressed in simpler garments. White cotton that somehow made him seem even more imposing, more real. He looked at her across the expanse of the room, and for several heartbeats, neither of them moved. Then Khalid did something unexpected. He walked not toward her, but toward the low-cushioned seating area near the window. He sat down with easy grace and gestured to the space beside him. "Come," he said. "Sit with me." Layla hesitated, every muscle in her body tense. This wasn't how she'd imagined it would start. She'd expected, well, she didn't know exactly what she'd expected, but not this casual invitation, not this patience. Slowly, carefully, she moved toward him, perching on the edge of the cushions with her spine rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Khalid poured 2 cups of tea from the service that had been left for them. The movements practiced and unhurried. He offered her one, and she took it with shaking hands, grateful for something to hold, something to do. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle whisper of wind through the open window, carrying with it the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the gardens below. "You've never been alone with a man before," Khalid observed, his tone neutral, merely stating a fact. "No," Layla whispered. "Never. Not like this." He nodded as if she'd confirmed something he already suspected. "And you've been told very little about what happens between a husband and wife." Her cheeks burned, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "I know the basic facts. I'm not a child." "I didn't say you were," Khalid replied, and there was no condescension in his voice, only a careful respect that surprised her. But knowing facts isn't the same as understanding, and it certainly isn't the same as being ready. Layla blinked, confused by the direction of this conversation. She'd expected demands, expectations, perhaps some attempt at seduction. Instead, he was talking to her as if her readiness mattered, as if her comfort was something he considered worth his time. "I don't understand," she admitted. "What do you want from me?" Khalid set down his teacup and turned to face her fully, his expression serious, but not unkind. "I want to know who you are," he said simply. "Beyond the daughter of Al-Qamar, beyond the political alliance our marriage represents. I want to know Layla." The way he said her name, with careful pronunciation, as if it mattered, made something tight in her chest loosen just slightly. No one had asked her that before. No one had cared who she was beyond her function, her role, her usefulness to family plans. "I don't," she started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "I don't know if I know how to answer that." "Then start somewhere simple," Khalid suggested. "Tell me something true. Anything. What do you love? What do you fear? What do you dream about when you're alone?" Layla looked down at her hands, at the intricate henna pattern still drying on her skin, symbols of a future she hadn't chosen. But Khalid's question hung in the air, genuine, patient, waiting. And slowly, hesitantly, she began to speak. "I love music," she said quietly. "Playing the oud. My tutor says I have a gift for it, though I don't know if that's true or if he's just being kind. When I play, it's the only time I feel like myself instead of what everyone expects me to be." Khalid listened without interrupting, his attention complete and unwavering. She found herself continuing, the words coming easier now. "I fear," she paused, gathering courage. "I fear being invisible, being just a function, a tool for alliances and heirs. I fear that I'll spend my whole life being what other people need, and never discover what I might have been if I'd had the chance to choose. And I dream," her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I dream about the desert, about riding across the dunes with nothing but sky above me, about being free. The silence that followed her confession felt heavy with meaning. Layla risked a glance at Khalid's face, expecting judgment or perhaps dismissal of her foolish dreams. Instead, she found something that looked almost like recognition, as if he understood that particular loneliness, that specific hunger for freedom. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "I grew up in the Northern Territories," he said, his gaze distant, focused on something beyond the walls. "My father believed that a sheikh should know his land intimately, every wadi, every plateau, every place where water could be found. From the time I was 7, he would take me on long rides, sometimes for days, with nothing but our horses and the stars to guide us." Layla found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into his words despite her nervousness. "It sounds beautiful," she murmured. It was, Khalid agreed. And it was brutal. The desert doesn't forgive weakness. It doesn't care about your title or your bloodline. Out there, you're just a man trying to survive. My father wanted me to understand that. To never forget that leadership isn't about power. It's about responsibility to people who depend on you for their survival." He paused, and something painful flickered across his face. "He died when I was 19. A tribal dispute that turned violent. I became Sheikh before I was ready, before I truly understood what it meant to hold other people's lives in your hands." "I'm sorry," Layla said softly, and she meant it. She'd lost her mother young. She understood that particular grief. Khalid nodded in acknowledgement. "The point is," he continued, "I understand what it means to be shaped by duty, to have your path chosen before you could choose it yourself. This marriage, it wasn't my choice any more than it was yours. I need the alliance with your father's territories." "You need," he hesitated. "What you need, I'm not entirely sure yet. But I know you didn't choose this." The honesty was startling. Layla had expected many things from this night, but not this raw admission that he too felt trapped by circumstances, that he too carried burdens he hadn't asked for. It made him suddenly more human, less the intimidating figure of power, and more simply a man trying to navigate expectations he hadn't set. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice steadier than before. "We're married. We have obligations, duties." Khalid's eyes met hers, dark and intense but not threatening. "We do," he agreed. "But those duties don't have to be fulfilled tonight." Layla's breath caught. "What?" "I'm saying," Khalid spoke slowly, carefully, as if he wanted to make absolutely certain she understood, "that you're terrified. And I have no interest in being the kind of man who demands intimacy from a woman who's shaking with fear. Our marriage is legally binding. The contracts are signed. No one can undo that. But what happens in this room, between us, that can wait until you're ready." She stared at him, unable to quite believe what she was hearing. "But people will expect. There will be questions. Proof." She fumbled over the words, her face burning. "Let them question," Khalid said with a shrug that suggested he had very little concern for gossip. "I don't answer to palace servants or nosy relatives, and neither do you, not anymore. You answer to me, and I'm telling you that your fear matters more than their expectations." Layla felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Hope. It was terrifying in its own way, because hope meant vulnerability, meant believing that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be the nightmare she'd imagined. But she started, searching his face for any sign of deception or manipulation. "Why would you do this? What do you gain?" "Peace of mind," Khalid answered simply. "I've commanded men in battle. I've negotiated treaties with tribal leaders who would sooner cut my throat than shake my hand. I've made hard decisions that cost lives. But I've never, he leaned forward, his intensity pinning her in place. I've never taken something that wasn't freely given. And I won't start with my own wife. Your body is yours, Layla. It will always be yours. When you share it with me, if you share it with me, it will be because you choose to, not because you fear the consequences of refusal. The word settled over her like a protective cloak, warming places inside her that had been frozen with dread. She wanted to believe him. Every instinct that hadn't been crushed by duty and fear wanted desperately to trust that he meant what he said. But trust was a fragile thing, and she'd learned early that people said many beautiful things they didn't mean. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she whispered. "How do I know this isn't just manipulation, another way to control me?" Khalid didn't look offended by the question. If anything, he seemed to respect it. "You don't know," he admitted. "You have no reason to trust me. We're strangers bound together by politics and family ambition. All you have is my word, and words are cheap. So I'll offer you this instead." He stood, moving to a carved wooden chest in the corner of the room. From it, he withdrew a simple cotton sleeping gown and a light blanket. "Take the bed," he said, offering her the items. "I'll sleep here, on the cushions. The door remains unlocked. You're free to leave this room any time you wish, to walk the gardens, to find your aunt, to go anywhere in this palace. You're not a prisoner, Layla. You're my wife, and that means you're under my protection, including protection from me, if that's what you need." Layla took the sleeping gown with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the gesture. She'd come into this room expecting violation, expected to endure what she'd been taught was simply the price of being a woman, of being married. Instead, she was being offered choice, agency, safety. It was so unexpected that she felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. Khalid's expression softened. "Don't thank me for basic decency," he said quietly. "Thank me when I've earned it, when I've proven that my words and my actions align. For now, just rest. We have time, Layla, more time than you think." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and retreated behind the silk curtains to change. Her hand shook as she removed the heavy wedding gown, folding it carefully despite the turmoil of emotions swirling inside her. The simple cotton sleeping gown felt like freedom after the weight of ceremonial fabric. When she emerged, Khalid had already settled on the cushions by the window, his back to her, giving her privacy even now. She slipped into the bed, pulling the silk coverlet over herself, and lay staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. She could hear his steady breathing from across the room, could sense his presence even with distance between them. It should have frightened her, being alone in the dark with a man she barely knew. Instead, she felt something entirely unexpected. Safe. Protected. As if perhaps, against all odds, she'd been given something precious. Not just time, but the possibility that this marriage might become something more than a duty. That it might, eventually, become a choice she made freely. Sleep came slowly, but when it finally did, Layla dreamed not of fear or obligation, but of desert horizons stretching endlessly under stars, of freedom that tasted like possibility, of a voice saying her name like it mattered, like she was more than a political alliance, like she was Layla, simply and completely herself. Morning came with golden light filtering through the silk curtains, painting the room in warm amber tones. Layla woke slowly, disoriented for a moment before memory rushed back. The wedding, the fear, the unexpected conversation, Khalid's promise to wait. She sat up carefully, pushing her tangled hair back from her face, and looked toward the cushions by the window. They were empty. For a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. Had he left? Had last night been some elaborate game? Then she noticed the note weighted down by a small silver cup on the table beside the bed. The script was elegant, confident. I have meetings with the tribal council that will take most of the morning. There's fresh fruit and tea in the adjoining room. The palace is yours to explore. If you need anything, ask for Samir. He's my personal attendant and completely trustworthy. I'll return this afternoon. Khalid. Layla read it twice, trying to parse the meaning behind the simple words. He was giving her space, treating her not as a possession to be controlled, but as a person with autonomy. It was such a small thing, really, just a note and permission to move freely. But after a lifetime of restrictions and surveillance, it felt revolutionary. She rose and found the adjoining room, a smaller chamber set up as a private sitting area. True to his word, there was a breakfast spread, fresh pomegranate, dates still warm from the sun, flat bread, yogurt with honey, mint tea steaming in a delicate pot. Her stomach growled, reminding her she'd barely eaten during the feast. She sat cross-legged on the cushions and ate slowly, savoring each bite, allowing herself to simply exist in this quiet morning moment, without fear pressing on her chest. After breakfast, Layla bathed in the private hammam attached to the chambers, luxuriating in hot water scented with rose and jasmine. She washed away the henna, the perfumes, the weight of yesterday, emerging feeling more like herself. She dressed in simple clothes, a soft linen dress in pale blue, her hair braided loosely down her back. Then, because Khalid had said she could, she decided to explore. The palace was different in daylight, less imposing, more beautiful. She wandered through corridors she'd never been allowed to access before, discovering courtyards with fountains that sang, libraries filled with manuscripts so old they had to be handled with reverent care, music rooms with instruments from a dozen different cultures. In one of these rooms, she found an oud, its wood polished to a deep glow, and she couldn't resist. She sat down and began to play, her fingers finding the familiar patterns, the notes flowing like water, like breath, like the truest version of herself. She was so lost in the music that she didn't hear anyone approach. It was only when the last note faded that she became aware of someone standing in the doorway. Her head snapped up, and she found Khalid watching her, his expression unreadable. Her hands froze on the strings. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to presume. I shouldn't have. Don't apologize," Khalid interrupted, stepping into the room. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "That was extraordinary. You have true talent." Layla felt her cheeks warm under his praise. "It's just something I enjoy," she said, deflecting as she'd been taught to do. "No," Khalid said, moving closer. "It's more than that. That kind of skill, that kind of emotional expression, it doesn't come from casual enjoyment. It comes from need, from using music to say what words can't." He sat down across from her, his posture relaxed, but his attention intense. "Play something else." Layla hesitated, then nodded. She played a piece her tutor had taught her years ago, a traditional melody about longing and distance, about loving someone you couldn't reach. Her fingers moved across the strings with practiced grace, and she let herself sink into the music, forgetting for a moment that she had an audience. When she finished, Khalid was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You play like someone who understands loneliness." Layla met his eyes, surprised by the observation. "I suppose I do," she admitted. "Even surrounded by people, I've always felt alone. Like I was going through motions but never really connecting." He nodded slowly. "I understand that," he said. "Leadership is lonely. Everyone wants something from you. Your judgment, your protection, your resources. But no one asks what you need. No one sees past the role to the person carrying it. It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. In that moment, Layla saw not the powerful Sheikh, not the political alliance, but simply a man who carried burdens in silence, who understood her particular flavor of isolation because he lived it too. "Is that why you gave me last night?" she asked quietly. "Because you understand what it's like to have no choice." "Partly," Khalid admitted. "But also because I've seen what happens when people are forced into intimacy before they're ready. I've seen the damage it causes, the way it breaks something fundamental in a person. I won't do that to you, Layla. I won't break you to serve my convenience." The conviction in his voice made her chest tight. She wanted to ask more, to understand what experiences had taught him this compassion. But before she could, a servant appeared in the doorway, bowing respectfully. "My lord, the afternoon council is assembled. They're waiting." Khalid sighed, a brief flash of frustration crossing his face. "Of course they are," he muttered. Then, to Layla, "I'm sorry. Duty calls. But tonight, if you're willing, I'd like to have dinner with you. Just the two of us. So we can talk more. Get to know each other properly." It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation, one she could refuse if she chose. That small courtesy, that acknowledgement of her agency, made all the difference. "I'd like that," Layla said. And she meant it. Khalid smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face into something warm and approachable. "Then I'll see you this evening. And Layla, keep playing. This palace could use more music." He left, and Layla sat alone in the music room, the oud still resting in her lap, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Anticipation that wasn't rooted in fear, but in genuine curiosity about who this man might be beneath the titles and responsibilities. The days that followed established a pattern that surprised Layla with its gentleness. Each morning, Khalid would leave early for councils and meetings, governance demands that required his attention. But he always left notes, small messages that ranged from practical information about palace routines to observations that revealed pieces of himself. The rose garden is particularly beautiful at dawn if you're an early riser. I walked through it this morning and thought of you. There's a mare in the stables, white with a silver mane. She's gentle despite her spirit. If you'd like to ride, Samir will arrange it. Layla found herself looking forward to these notes, to the glimpses they offered of a man who noticed beauty, who thought of her comfort, who was trying in his own way to build connection. She began leaving her own messages in return, small responses that felt daring in their honesty. "I did walk the rose garden at dawn. You were right, it's breathtaking. Thank you for sharing it with me. I rode the silver mare today. Her name is Noor, which seems fitting. She runs like liquid moonlight." Their dinners together became the anchors of each day. Khalid would return in the evenings, and they would eat together in the private chambers, just the two of them with simple food and endless conversation. They talked about everything: his childhood in the Northern Territories, her sheltered palace life, politics and poetry, music and philosophy, dreams and fears. Khalid was an attentive listener, asking questions that showed genuine interest, never dismissing her thoughts even when they disagreed. One evening, perhaps a week after their wedding, Layla found the courage to ask something she'd been wondering. "Why did you agree to this marriage? You're powerful enough to have refused." Khalid set down his cup, considering the question seriously. "Power isn't the same as freedom," he said. "I need the alliance with your father's territory. The water rights alone are crucial for my people's survival. And there were those in my council who wanted this connection, who saw it as strategic necessity." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "But if I'm being completely honest, there was another reason." Layla waited, her heart beating faster. I was tired, Khalid admitted. Tired of being alone in crowds. Tired of relationships built entirely on what I could provide. When the marriage was proposed, when I learned about you, I thought perhaps, he hesitated, searching for words. Perhaps this could be different. An arrangement that might grow into something real, given time and patience. Was that naive? No, Layla said softly. I think that was hopeful. There's a difference. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition of shared loneliness seeking connection. Khalid reached across the small table, his hand extended palm up, an offering, not a demand. Layla looked at his hand, calloused and strong, capable of both violence and gentleness. She thought about the week they'd spent together, the patience he'd shown, the respect he'd demonstrated. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and careful. They sat like that for a long moment, this simple touch feeling more intimate than anything physical because it was chosen, freely given. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Layla said quietly. I want you to know that. Khalid's thumb brushed across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. I'm glad, he murmured. But Layla, you should never be afraid to tell me if something I do makes you uncomfortable. This only works if we're honest with each other. The conversation continued late into the night, and when Khalid finally rose to take his customary place on the cushions by the window, Layla found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to. You don't have to sleep there, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Khalid froze, turning to look at her with an expression of careful neutrality. Layla, he started. I'm not saying, she interrupted, her cheeks burning but her voice steady. I'm not saying I'm ready for everything, but you could sleep in the bed. We could just sleep together, like two people sharing space. For a moment, Khalid didn't move. Then he said, his voice rough, Are you certain? Because there's no pressure, no expectation. I'm certain, Layla confirmed, surprising herself with how true it was. I trust you. Those 3 words hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. Khalid crossed the room slowly, as if approaching something precious that might startle and flee. He lay down on the far side of the large bed, maintaining careful distance, but his presence was warm and solid, and somehow comforting. They lay in the darkness, not touching, just breathing in synchronicity. And Layla felt something inside her relax, a tension she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. Good night, Layla, Khalid whispered into the darkness. Good night, she whispered back. And for the first time since her wedding day, she fell asleep easily, peacefully, without fear or dread. Just a quiet contentment that felt like the beginning of something that might, eventually, become love. The shift in their relationship was gradual, like sand slowly reshaping dunes. Sharing the bed became normal, though Khalid maintained respectful distance, never presuming, never pushing. But there were small changes. Layla would wake to find his hand had drifted across the space between them in sleep, his fingers barely touching her arm. She found she didn't mind. In fact, she found she liked it. The unconscious reach for connection, the body's honest desire for closeness, even when the mind was guarded. During the days, Khalid began including her in aspects of his work. He would ask her opinion on disputes he was mediating, valuing her perspective on matters involving families and relationships. You see things I miss, he told her once. You understand the emotional undercurrents that drive people's actions. That's valuable. Being valued for her insight rather than her appearance or bloodline was intoxicating. Layla found herself becoming bolder, offering observations unsolicited, even disagreeing with Khalid when she thought he was wrong. To her delight, he didn't punish disagreement. He considered it, engaged with it, sometimes even changed his position based on her arguments. One afternoon, Khalid found her in the library, surrounded by scrolls and manuscripts. "What are you researching?" he asked, settling beside her with genuine curiosity. "Water management systems," Layla said, gesturing to the documents spread before her. "I was reading about the ancient Qanat systems, underground channels that moved water across deserts without evaporation loss. I thought perhaps some of these techniques could be adapted for the drought-affected villages you mentioned." Khalid stared at her for a moment, then began examining the scrolls with increased interest. "This is brilliant," he said, his voice filled with something that sounded like amazement. "These principles combined with modern engineering, we could potentially solve irrigation problems that have plagued those regions for generations." "You really think so?" Layla asked, pleased but trying not to show how much his approval meant. "I know so," Khalid confirmed. He looked at her with an expression she was learning to recognize, admiration mixed with something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken. "You're extraordinary, you know that." Layla ducked her head, embarrassed but secretly thrilled. "I just like solving problems," she murmured. "Then you and I are well matched," Khalid said softly, "because I'm surrounded by problems that need solving, and I'm discovering I quite like having a partner to help solve them." Partner. The word resonated through Layla's chest like a bell struck in a silent room. Not possession, not ornament, not even just wife. Partner. Equal. Valued. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Layla found herself standing closer to Khalid than usual as they talked about plans for implementing the water systems. He was explaining the political challenges of getting tribal leaders to agree to new methods when she realized she was staring at his mouth, watching the way his lips formed words, wondering what they would feel like against hers. As if sensing her thoughts, Khalid trailed off mid-sentence, his eyes dropping to her lips, then back to her eyes. "Layla," he said, his voice lower, rougher. "Yes," she breathed. "If I were to kiss you," he said carefully, "would that be welcome? Or too much too soon?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. She thought about all the ways he'd been patient, all the times he'd put her comfort above his own desires, all the small kindnesses that had built trust between them. She thought about how safe she felt with him, how valued, how seen. And she realized with sudden clarity that she wanted this, wanted him, not from obligation but from genuine desire. Yes, she whispered. It would be welcome. Khalid moved slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, to step back. But Layla stayed exactly where she was, tilting her face up toward his. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing across her skin with exquisite gentleness. Then, his lips touched hers, soft, questioning, achingly tender. It was nothing like the aggressive claiming she'd feared. It was a conversation, a question asked and answered, a shared exploration of new territory. Layla's hands found their way to his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him through the thin fabric of his sleep clothes, feeling his heart beating as rapidly as her own. The kiss deepened slightly, but Khalid maintained that careful gentleness, never demanding more than she was willing to give. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Layla felt dizzy with sensation, with the discovery that desire didn't have to be frightening, that it could be beautiful when shared with someone who cared about her pleasure as much as his own. "That was," she started, then stopped, unable to find adequate words. "Perfect?" Khalid suggested, his voice rough, but his eyes warm with affection and something hotter, barely restrained. Yes, Layla confirmed, smiling. That. They climbed into bed together, and for the first time, Khalid pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arm draped protectively over her waist. She could feel the evidence of his desire pressed against her, but he made no move to act on it, just held her, his breath warm against her neck. "Is this all right?" he murmured. "More than all right," Layla whispered back, marveling at how safe she felt, how cherished, how completely not afraid. The kiss opened a door between them, and over the following weeks, they walked through it together at a pace that felt right for both. There were more kisses, longer, deeper, exploring the taste and texture of each other. There were tentative touches. Khalid's hands learning the curve of her waist, the small of her back, the line of her neck, Layla's fingers discovering the strength in his shoulders, the surprising softness of his hair, the way his breath would catch when she touched him certain ways. But Khalid never pushed further, never pressured for more than Layla offered freely. It was maddening in the best possible way, this slow build of tension and desire. She found herself thinking about him constantly, noticing the way his hands moved when he worked, the sound of his laugh, the feel of his body against hers when they slept. She was falling in love, she realized one morning as she watched him sleep, his face peaceful and younger in repose. Not the dutiful affection she'd been told wives should cultivate, but real, deep, passionate love, born from respect and friendship and genuine liking of who he was as a person. One evening, after a particularly frustrating council meeting that Khalid had allowed her to attend, they returned to their chambers, both tense with residual anger at the tribal leader who'd been unreasonably stubborn. "That man is impossible," Layla fumed, pacing the room. "His people are dying of thirst, and he refuses aid because of a generations-old grudge that no one even remembers the origin of." Khalid watched her pace, a slight smile playing at his lips despite his own frustration. "What?" Layla demanded, stopping to face him. "Why are you smiling?" "Because you're magnificent when you're angry," Khalid said, his voice warm with affection. "Because you care about people you've never met. Because you fight for what's right even when it's difficult. Because you've become essential to me, Layla, in ways I didn't anticipate and couldn't have planned for." The declaration stopped her in her tracks. She stared at him, her anger forgotten, replaced by something that felt too big to contain. "I love you," she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "I know I shouldn't. It's too soon. We barely know each other. But I do. I love you, Khalid." For a moment, he was utterly still. Then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with an intensity that stole her breath. "I love you too," he said against her lips, between kisses that grew increasingly desperate. "God, Layla, I love you so much, it terrifies me." She pulled back enough to see his face, to read the truth in his eyes. "Then show me," she whispered. "I'm ready. I want you. I want this." Khalid's hands tightened on her waist. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice strained with the effort of restraint. "Because once I'm certain," Layla interrupted, her own hands working at the fastenings of his robes. "I trust you completely. I want you completely. Show me everything." Khalid swept her into his arms, carrying her to the bed, with a gentleness that belied his obvious desire. He laid her down on the silk sheets, as if she were something infinitely precious, then paused, looking down at her with an expression that made her chest tight. "I'll be gentle," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise, Layla. I'll take care of you." "I know," she said simply. "I've always known." They undressed each other slowly. learning each other's bodies, with reverent touches and whispered praises. When Khalid's hands trembled slightly, Layla realized with wonder that he was nervous too, that this mattered to him as much as it did to her. He kept his promise. Every touch was careful, measured, designed to bring pleasure rather than pain. He watched her face constantly, reading her reactions, adjusting based on her responses. "Talk to me," he murmured against her skin. "Tell me what you feel. Tell me if anything hurts." "It doesn't hurt," Layla gasped, overwhelmed by sensations she'd never imagined. Oh, Khalid. Words failed her, as his skilled hands and mouth brought her to heights she hadn't known existed. She clung to him, her nails digging into his shoulders, her body arching into his touch, completely lost in the moment. When he finally joined their bodies, moving with exquisite slowness, giving her time to adjust, the initial discomfort was there, but manageable, made bearable by his constant reassurance, his whispered endearments, his obvious restraint. "Breathe," he coached, his own breath ragged. "Just breathe, love. I've got you." And she did breathe, did relax into him, and the discomfort faded, replaced by a fullness that felt right, felt like completion. "Move," she whispered. "Please, Khalid. I need." He moved then, setting a rhythm that was gentle but thorough, each stroke deliberate, controlled, designed to bring them both pleasure. Layla had expected pain, awkwardness, something to endure. Instead, she found wonder, intimacy that went beyond physical joining, a connection that seemed to fuse not just their bodies, but their souls. When release came, it crashed over her in waves that left her gasping, crying out his name, her entire body shaking with the force of it. Khalid followed moments later, his own control shattering as he buried his face in her neck, groaning her name like a prayer. They collapsed together, tangled and sweating and utterly spent, hearts racing in synchronized rhythm. For a long time, neither spoke. Khalid rolled to his side, pulling Layla close against him, his hand stroking gentle patterns on her back. "Are you all right?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. "Did I hurt you?" "No," Layla said, and she was surprised to find tears on her cheeks, happy tears, overwhelmed tears. "You didn't hurt me. You made me feel." She struggled for words adequate to the experience. "You made me feel loved. Completely, perfectly loved." Khalid's arms tightened around her. "You are loved," he whispered fiercely. "So deeply loved, Layla. You're everything I didn't know I needed." The months that followed were the happiest of Layla's life. The physical intimacy between them continued to deepen and grow, each encounter revealing new dimensions of pleasure and connection. But it was more than just the physical. Khalid included her in every aspect of his governance, valuing her counsel, implementing her ideas. Together, they revolutionized the water management systems across the territories, bringing relief to villages that had struggled for generations. They established schools where girls could learn alongside boys, a controversial move that Khalid defended fiercely, citing Layla's own brilliance as proof of what women could achieve when given opportunity. Layla discovered she had a gift for diplomacy, for finding common ground between feuding parties, for seeing solutions that satisfied everyone's core needs, even if they didn't get everything they wanted. Khalid began bringing her to councils not as decoration, but as co-leader, and slowly, grudgingly, even the most traditional tribal elders began to respect her wisdom. "You've changed everything," Khalid told her one evening as they reviewed plans for a new irrigation project. "Not just the territories, though your impact there is undeniable. You've changed me, made me better, softer in the ways that matter, stronger where it counts." Layla smiled, reaching for his hand. "We've changed each other," she corrected. You taught me that I could be more than I was told, that my voice mattered, that I deserved to choose my own path. The irony, Khalid said thoughtfully, is that this marriage which neither of us chose became the thing that gave us both true choice. True freedom, paradoxically, through commitment. Exactly, Layla agreed. We chose each other, even though the marriage was arranged. We chose love, even though duty would have been enough. As winter approached, bringing cool winds and rare rains to the desert, Layla discovered she was pregnant. The realization came with a mix of joy and trepidation. She'd always wanted children, but the reality of it, of bringing new life into the world, of the vulnerability and responsibility it represented, was overwhelming. She waited until evening to tell Khalid, when they were alone in their chambers, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Khalid," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from the reports he'd been reviewing, immediately attentive to the tone in her voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "No," she said quickly. "Nothing's wrong. At least, I don't think so. She took a breath. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, Khalid was completely still. Then his face transformed, joy and wonder, and something almost like fear flickering across his features. "Truly," he breathed. "Yes," Layla confirmed. "The physician confirmed it this morning. We're going to have a child." Khalid crossed to her in 2 strides, dropping to his knees in front of where she sat, his hands coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "A child," he repeated, his voice filled with awe. "Our child." He looked up at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "Layla, I don't have words. I'm terrified," she admitted. "What if I'm not a good mother? What if something goes wrong? What if—" Khalid stood, pulling her into his arms. "We'll figure it out together," he said firmly, "just like we've figured out everything else. You're going to be an extraordinary mother, Layla. And our child," he paused, his hand splaying protectively over her stomach. "Our child is going to grow up knowing they're loved, knowing they have choices, knowing they can be whoever they're meant to be." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Khalid became impossibly protective, fretting over her health, insisting she rest more, trying to shield her from stress. Layla found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," she told him one afternoon, when he'd tried to prevent her from attending a particularly contentious council meeting. "I can still think, still work, still contribute." "I know," Khalid said, looking sheepish. "I know you're capable. The thought of anything happening to you or the baby, it terrifies me in ways I've never been afraid before." Layla softened, understanding the fear that drove his overprotectiveness. She took his face between her hands. "We're going to be fine," she said gently. "Both of us. But I need you to trust me to know my own limits, to speak up if I need rest. Don't treat me like I'm breakable, Khalid. Treat me like I'm strong enough to carry this, because I am." He nodded, kissing her forehead. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'll try to worry less visibly." She laughed. "I'm not asking for miracles, just conscious effort." As her belly grew, Layla found herself marveling at the changes in her body, at the life growing inside her. Khalid would spend evenings with his hand on her stomach, talking to their unborn child, telling stories of the desert, of the territories they would inherit, of the love that awaited them. "You're going to be so loved," he would murmur. "So wanted. So free to be exactly who you are." Layla would listen, her heart full, thinking about how far they'd both come from that first frightened night, how what had begun as duty had transformed into the deepest love she'd ever known. One night, Late in her pregnancy, when sleep was difficult and the baby was particularly active, Khalid held her close, his hand feeling the strong kicks against her belly. "Do you ever regret it?" Layla asked quietly into the darkness. "Regret what?" "This marriage. The arrangement that brought us together. Would you have chosen differently if you'd had complete freedom?" Khalid was quiet for a moment, considering. "I don't know who I would have chosen if left entirely to my own devices," he finally said. "But I know with absolute certainty that I couldn't have chosen better than you. You're my partner, my love, my equal in every way that matters. So no, Layla, I have no regrets. Only gratitude that fate, chance, politics, whatever forces brought us together, were kind enough to give me you." Their daughter was born on a spring morning when the desert bloomed with rare flowers after the winter rains. The labor was long and difficult, and Khalid paced outside the birthing chamber like a caged lion, refusing to leave despite the midwife's assurances that everything was progressing normally. When he finally heard the baby's first cry, strong and indignant, he nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife emerged, smiling. "My lord, you have a daughter. Mother and child are both healthy and strong." Khalid entered the chamber to find Layla exhausted, but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "She's perfect," Layla whispered. "Khalid, she's absolutely perfect." He approached slowly, almost reverently, looking down at the small face visible within the blankets. His daughter had Layla's delicate features, dark hair already thick and curling, and when she opened her eyes briefly, they were dark like his own. Something in his chest cracked open, a love so fierce and protective it was almost painful. "Can I?" he asked, and Layla carefully transferred the baby into his arms. Khalid held his daughter with infinite gentleness, this tiny creature who was half him and half the woman he loved more than life itself. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your father. I promise to protect you, to love you, to make sure you grow up free to choose your own path. You'll never be a pawn in political games. You'll never be told your worth is only in what you can offer others. You're going to be extraordinary." They named her Amara, which meant eternal, because the love they felt for her seemed to transcend time itself. Watching Khalid with their daughter, seeing the fierce gentleness with which he cared for this tiny being, Layla fell in love with him all over again. He was a natural father, patient with sleepless nights, delighted by every small milestone, completely unashamed to be seen walking the palace corridors, bouncing a fussy baby against his shoulder while conducting state business. Amara grew, and true to her parents' promises, she was raised with freedom to explore her interests and develop her gifts. By the time she was 5, it was clear she had her mother's musical talent and her father's strategic mind. She would sit in on council meetings, asking questions that sometimes cut to the heart of issues the adults were dancing around. She learned to ride almost before she could walk properly, tearing across the desert on her pony with absolute fearlessness, while both parents watched with hearts in their throats. "You've created a force of nature," Khalid told Layla one evening, as they watched Amara convince a group of older children to include her in their game through sheer force of personality. "She gets that from you," Layla countered, "that absolute certainty that she belongs wherever she chooses to be." "No," Khalid said thoughtfully. "She gets that from both of us. From you, the courage to claim her space. From me, the confidence to lead. And from our love, the security to be fully herself without fear." As years passed, their family grew. 2 more children, a son they named Rashid, and another daughter, Zara. Each was raised with the same philosophy that had guided Amara's upbringing, that they were loved unconditionally, that their worth was inherent, that they had the freedom to choose their own paths. The palace that had once felt like a prison to Layla became a home filled with laughter and music and the controlled chaos of children being children. Khalid and Layla's partnership continued to transform the territories. They implemented educational reforms, established trade relationships with distant lands, created systems of governance that balanced traditional wisdom with progressive ideas. They became known not just as effective leaders, but as proof that arranged marriages could become love matches, that duty and desire weren't necessarily opposing forces, that two people committed to growing together could build something extraordinary. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Khalid took Layla on the desert ride she'd once dreamed about. They rode for 3 days across the dunes, just the two of them, and the endless sky, camping under stars that seemed close enough to touch. On the final evening, as they sat by the fire watching the sunset paint the sand in shades of gold and rose, Khalid pulled Layla close against him. "Do you remember our wedding night?" he asked. "How could I forget?" Layla replied. "I was terrified." "So was I," Khalid admitted, surprising her. "Not of you, but of failing you, of being the kind of man who would take without thought for your fear or your needs. I'd seen that kind of cruelty before, and I swore I would never be that person." "That's why you waited," Layla said, understanding clicking into place. "Why you gave me time and choice." Khalid nodded. "I knew if we were going to build anything real, it had to be built on respect and trust. I couldn't demand your love. I could only hope to earn it." "You did more than earn it," Layla said, turning in his arms to face him. "You taught me what love should look like, what partnership means. You gave me myself, Khalid, my voice, my agency, my power. And in doing that, you gave me the capacity to love you freely and fully." They made love under the stars that night, their bodies moving together with the practiced ease of 10 years of intimacy, but also with the wonder and tenderness of that first time. Afterward, wrapped in blankets against the desert night's chill, Layla thought about the girl she'd been, terrified in a wedding gown, certain her life was ending. If she could speak to that girl now, she would tell her that sometimes the things we fear most become our greatest blessings, that arranged marriages can become love stories, that the right partner doesn't complete you, but empowers you to become more fully yourself. "I love you," she whispered to Khalid, "forever and always." "Forever and always," he echoed, his arms tightening around her. And somewhere in the palace they'd left behind, 3 children slept safely, loved unconditionally, free to dream their own dreams. Living proof that love freely given and carefully nurtured could change not just 2 people, but ripple outward to transform an entire world. 20 years after their wedding, Layla stood in the music room where Khalid had first heard her play, watching their eldest daughter Amara prepare for her own wedding. But this wedding was different from Layla's had been. Amara had chosen her partner, a scholar from a neighboring territory, who shared her passion for poetry and philosophy. There had been no arrangement, no political necessity, only love freely given and received. "You look beautiful," Layla said, adjusting the delicate veil that fell over Amara's dark hair. Amara smiled at her reflection, then turned to embrace her mother. "I'm not afraid," she said. "Not the way you were." "I know," Layla replied, her voice thick with emotion. "That was always the goal, you know, that you would have the choice I didn't, that you'd enter marriage as an equal, not as a possession." "You gave me that," Amara said fiercely. "You and Father both. You showed me what real partnership looks like, what love should be. Khalid entered the room, now in his 50s, but still commanding, his dark hair streaked with distinguished silver, his face marked by lines that spoke of laughter and responsibility in equal measure. He stopped at the sight of his daughter in her wedding gown, and Layla saw tears well in his eyes. "Don't you dare cry," Amara warned, her own voice unsteady. "You'll make me cry, and then Mother will cry, and we'll all be a disaster." "Too late," Khalid said roughly, crossing to embrace his daughter. "You're so beautiful, Amara, so strong. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." Layla watched father and daughter together, fullest versions of themselves. After Amara left for her wedding ceremony, Khalid found Layla in their private chambers, standing by the window overlooking the gardens. She'd been crying. He could tell from the slight redness around her eyes. "Sad to see her go?" he asked gently, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Not sad, exactly," Layla said, leaning back against him. "More reflective, thinking about cycles and change, about how different her beginning is from mine. That's what we worked for," Khalid reminded her, "to break the cycle, to give our children freedom we didn't have." "I know," Layla agreed, "and I'm grateful. I just wish," she paused, "I wish I could go back and tell that terrified girl on her wedding night that everything would be all right, that the man waiting for her would become her greatest blessing." "Would you change it?" Khalid asked. "If you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you refuse the arrangement? Choose a different path?" Layla turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cradle his face. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for anything. Because yes, I was terrified. Yes, I had no choice. But Khalid, you gave me back my choice. You made me a partner. You loved me until I learned to love myself. Our story might have started with fear, but it became beautiful. It became everything." Khalid kissed her, deep and slow and full of 20 years of devotion. When they pulled apart, he said, "You made me better too, you know. I was so rigid before you, so convinced that strength meant never showing vulnerability. You taught me that true strength is in being gentle, in being patient, in recognizing that power without compassion is tyranny." Layla smiled. "We taught each other," she corrected. "That's what the best partnerships do." They attended Amara's wedding together, watching their daughter marry the man she'd chosen, seeing the love and equality in their relationship. Later, at the celebration, Khalid led Layla onto the dance floor as musicians played. Other couples joined them, but Layla was aware only of Khalid's arms around her, of the way they moved together, with the unconscious synchronization of 2 decades of partnership. "People think arranged marriages can't become love matches," Layla murmured. "They should see us. They should know it's possible." "It's possible," Khalid agreed, "but only with the right foundation. Respect, patience, willingness to put your partner's needs equal to your own. Too many people think marriage is about possession or control. Real marriage is about liberation, about becoming more fully yourself because someone sees you completely and loves what they see." Layla rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I see you completely," she said, "and I love everything I see." As the evening wore on, as they celebrated their daughter's happiness and remembered their own beginning, Layla thought about the journey they'd traveled. From fear to trust, from duty to desire, from strangers to soulmates. It hadn't been easy. There had been challenges and disagreements and moments of doubt. But they'd faced everything together, grown together, built something that would outlast them both in the children they'd raised and the territories they'd transformed. That night, alone in their chambers, with the celebration still echoing faintly through the palace, Khalid whispered the same words he'd said 20 years ago. "I'll be gentle, I promise." And Layla laughed, pulling him closer. "I know you will," she said. "You always are." They made love with the passion of new lovers and the deep knowing of old partners. A combination that only years of devotion could create. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Khalid said thoughtfully, "Do you know what I'm most proud of? Not the territories we've unified or the reforms we've implemented. I'm most proud that our children understand love as choice, that they'll never settle for less than partnership, that they know their worth." "That's our legacy," Layla agreed. "Not power or wealth, but the knowledge we've passed on about what love should be." Khalid kissed her temple. "I was so afraid that first night," he admitted. "Afraid I would hurt you, not just physically, but emotionally. Afraid I would become my worst fear, a man who took without thought for the cost." "You could never be that," Layla said firmly. "Your capacity for gentleness, for patience, for real love, that was always there. I just helped you see it." They fell asleep as they had for 20 years, bodies intertwined, hearts beating in rhythm. Two people who had been brought together by circumstance and had chosen every day since to stay together by love. And somewhere in the palace, in rooms filled with the next generation, the seeds they'd planted continued to grow, transforming not just their family, but the very understanding of what marriage could be when built on mutual respect and freely given love. In the quiet moments before sleep, Layla often thought about the arc of her life, about the girl who'd been led trembling to a wedding chamber and the woman she'd become, strong, valued, loved beyond measure. She thought about Khalid's first promise, "I'll be gentle, I promise," and how he'd kept that promise, not just that night, but every night since, in ways that went far beyond the physical. He'd been gentle with her fears, her insecurities, her dreams. He'd treated her heart with the same reverence he'd shown her body. Their story wasn't perfect. No story was. They'd had arguments, miscommunications, moments when the pressures of governance strained their patience with each other. But they'd learned to fight fair, to listen even when angry, to remember that they were partners facing problems together, never adversaries. And through it all, the foundation they'd built that first week, built on respect and patience and genuine care for each other's well-being, held firm. As sleep finally claimed her, Layla's last conscious thought was gratitude. Gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to Khalid. Gratitude for his wisdom in understanding that true power comes from empowering others. Gratitude for the life they'd built, the children they'd raised, the love that had grown from the most unlikely beginning into something that would echo through generations. And maybe that was the real lesson, the truth worth sharing. That love isn't always a thunderbolt or a fairy tale beginning. Sometimes love is a choice made daily, a commitment to see and value your partner, a willingness to grow together through challenges and changes. Sometimes the greatest love stories start not with passion, but with patience, not with certainty, but with trust built slowly over time. Khalid stirred beside her, unconsciously pulling her closer, even in sleep, and Layla smiled into the darkness. They'd been gentle with each other, gentle with themselves, gentle with the precious thing they'd built together. And that gentleness had become the foundation for everything beautiful in their lives.